Okay, this is the second of the kinship uh, VidCast. Um, Something that's I realized I didn't actually mention. It's sort of come up maybe in passing, but just to make it formal. Um, when you're looking at my classic sort of stereotype overgeneralization of this would be that Chinese social relationships are on one hand, emotional. I mean, any any investment you make in someone else has an emotional content to it. But there's also a large part of it which is very practical. So for example, the Chinese attitude towards the role of women, where on one hand you have a very restrictive, very structured role, and that's sort of like the stereotype. But it doesn't bother the Chinese to modify that stereotype based on actual need or actual situation. And that's not just the level of the individual, it's actually the level of the group. So on one hand, you have a society which, you think of the classic stereotype of China, say even just 100 years ago. You got women that are largely invisible. You've got the idea of concubines. You got men in total control. That's sort of classic stereotype of male dominance. It's sort of the image. But the reality is, of course, is Shishi the last, I don't know what you'd call her. She wasn't technically the empress, but certainly what you have is a ton of positions, even back then, where women are in positions of authority. It's just that they don't act in the traditional roles of women, but it doesn't mean that they can't move into other types of, quote, male, unquote, roles, as long as they're willing to make that sort of switch, if you might call it. And again, the society accepts it. Society might not be thrilled with it, but they accept the that sort of, the reality that that's not going to be that the norm doesn't have to be followed. Let's put it that way. And it's very typical of Chinese relationships. Chinese, at least in my view, Chinese social dynamics is one of the most practical that I can think of. They have a ton of rules, but they're also very comfortable in modifying those rules. They usually don't break them, but they modify them to an enormous extent based on the situation, based on the people involved, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very sort of situational. By contrast, I would argue that Japanese society is entirely emotionally based and it's not practical. So Japanese are so tied up in the emotional relationship, structure that they have that I don't think that it ever occurs to them, or I don't think the potential is ever there to make a bunch of exceptions to the rule, if you would. So I would argue that Japanese social relationships aren't situational at all. And actually, a good example of that would be this idea of importing the son-in-law, the fictive kin thing. Chinese would just, Chinese would have like 10 different ways to get it done and not have it formalized. Just because in that situation, you need to have a guy. Japanese society has it formalized, and there's one way, and that's the fictive kin importing a son-in-law. I don't know of any other way they do it. So, that to me, that's symptomatic of larger context of both societies. I would argue that Japanese social logic is based on emotional relationships, and they don't allow for situational variation. And to me, that makes it very difficult for among other things for them to deal with change. And I think that you're seeing that classically here in the 2020s. Chinese society has gone through a staggering amount of change, especially when you realize you got, not just the change in terms of dynamics, technology, et cetera, but also the fact that you have the revolution, the whole cultural revolution in the 1960s, 70s, which basically guts Chinese society in a ton of ways. And yet you look at Chinese now, and the social dynamics are, I would argue, in many ways, certainly as healthy. In fact, I would argue healthier than Japanese society, which, yeah, went through wars, but there weren't really changes in the social structure of the society in the way that Chinese went. So I would argue that Chinese society is more adaptable, and Japanese society much less so. And I think to a certain extent, Chinese success in overseas migration, Chinatowns that you see, whether it be London or San Francisco or whatever, Honolulu, the ability of Chinese to adapt to new situations collectively and individually is actually a reflection of this, if you would, flexibility. That the rules can be bent based on a situation. Japanese, I think, have a very difficult time with that, and we see this especially when you get things like concepts of education and business relationships. But we're going to get into that now with Oyub and Kobun. And so Japanese relationships are never based on pragmatics. They're based on emotional context. And if you don't understand that, I don't think you're ever going to have a functional chance in dealing with Japanese or understanding Japanese particularly. This is absolute key to them. Oyub and Kobun. Oyub and Kobun relationships this is a term that's used usually pretty specifically with the parent, mother, and the slash child subordinate. There's a bunch of different terms that Japanese use for this type of relationship. But the key thing here is they're unilateral and unidirectional. And this is actually really unusual. Most social relationships in societies have a direct sort of a version of what you might call balanced reciprocity in them. X does something for Y, and then Y does something for X. The classic parent-child bond in most societies, with the exception probably of American society, would be that, parents rear the kids, and then, when they get old, the kids, nurture the parents. The Chinese would be a classic example of that, Koreans also. Oyub and Kobun is a little different. And the other part of this is that it gets moved out just from the mother and child into contextual relationships that you see, for example, in the workplace, even in the classroom. So it gets used in a whole mess of ways that I don't know offhand of any other society that does this. So what you do is you have two halves of this, and they're, if you would, symmetrical, unidirectional parts. The one is but this is the parent. This would be the mother. So the classic image of this would be the mother. The mother is the emotional centerpiece of the child's life. The mother nurtures the kid. The mother raises the kid. The mother provides a role model for the kid. The mother is everything to the kid. And then what you have on the other hand would be the Kobun, would be the child. And so the parent on the one hand has a very dominant position in that they are under obligation to rear the child to the best of their ability. And Japanese society has very strict rules about what that best of the ability is. And you're not given any slack in terms of not making it. So this is a very rigid criteria, especially when you look at mother-child. The child then is constantly needing and being reinforced by the mother's relationship. So the child is very, if you would, from an emotional standpoint, can be very needy, in the sense that the child needs to have the mother doing stuff. Now this comes in, the classic image of this would be the idea of a kitten, something that's helpless. So the child can act very helpless. So then that provides a structure, if you would, for the mother's relationship. And this isn't, parts of this aren't uniquely Japanese, but the uniquely Japanese part is you import that dynamic, that relationship of senior and junior, which is the other way it's usually phrased. So the senior would be the Oyub, the junior would be the Kobun. So what you get is you find that same relationship applies between, especially in the workplace. Someone in the workplace, if you come into the workplace, someone in the workplace is supposed to, hopefully, if you're full time and you're sort of a salary person, someone in the workplace should become your Kobun. Now, it's possible that someone in the workplace that from prior to your being hired is actually going to be your usher, your Oyub, your senior. But it's usually someone, once you're hired, becomes the senior. They become the Oyub. And to them, you become the Kobun. You become the subordinate. And that relationship doesn't change in the entire time that you're at the business, at the company. Now, over time, what'll happen is the Oyub or the senior will usually acquire other folks that are their subordinates. So they will end up in the superior or senior role for maybe 3, 4, 5. We'll just say hypothetically up to 5 people maybe, and those 5 people will all be subordinate, and therefore, emotionally, socially tied to the senior. And so this makes, when you think about this, makes a very complicated situation, because especially if you compare it to the Chinese, what you don't see here is the generational division. In a Chinese family, what you have is you have the parents' generation, and that's one group. And then you have the kids' generation, that's another group. And most of your real close social bonding is within the generation. So brothers and sisters, cousins, such like that. In this situation, what you have is a direct line, if you would, between a senior or older generation and a junior, younger generation. And if you think about it in a business context, this gets real complicated real quick, because anyone in a Japanese company, say at the level of, lower middle level management and up, is not only going to be senior to a group of people underneath them, and that's where everyone's emotional and conceptual interests lie, but also they're going to be open to folks that brought them in. So every corporation, rather than being sort of, based on the unit or the division of the company or, whatever it is going to be based on the set of social relationships that make a particularly unique subset of the company. And that's where the individual's loyalties lie. So if you work for Matsushita, your loyalties don't lie with Matsushita. Your loyalties lie with the Oyabun who is taking you under their wing, if you would, when you came in and they become the senior and you become the junior. As they move up in the company, they will make sure that their juniors move up with them. So you need to have that Oyabun or senior around to help you up the corporate ladder. They're your protection. They're your guardians. That's a good way to think of it. As you move up the system, as new folks come into the company, you will become their Oyabun, you will become their senior, and they become your junior. But notice how they're junior to you, but you're junior to someone that's higher up than you. So this whole vertical alliance system, which is what I mentioned, is really how Japanese society operates. Is based on a structure of unequals. Seniors need the support of juniors, sort of their cheerleaders or whatever you want to call it, or backers. Juniors need the protection of and guidance and whatever of seniors. Now this creates a huge amount of trouble for Japanese companies, because what it means is, on one hand, everyone's loyal to the company, but that's a very hypothetical concept. In reality, in Japanese companies, everyone's loyal to their seniors. Now, what this also means is, if you got three guys at the same level, they're affiliated to different folks. In other words, they're juniors to somebody, but they're generally not going to be juniors at the same somebody. So they've come up in parallel, if you would, in the company. Then at some point, since as you go up the ranks, the number of positions shrinks. It's a pyramid. What's going to happen is there's going to be competition between various individuals to go up the next rank of the company. And each of those groups is going to have their own constituents, if you want to think of it that way, in terms of subordinates who are going to want them to go, because from a rather cynical standpoint, if they move up in the company, then their subordinates will be moved up with them. But that's going to be at the cost of another group of alliances, of seniors and juniors, of seniors and subordinates. So if one constituency wins, another constituency loses. And so this is the problem that Japanese corporations have. It's not so much, at the family, it's sort of complicated, because what it means is that brothers and sisters, even cousins, stuff like that, don't necessarily have the close emotional bonding that their Chinese or Korean counterparts do, because their relationship is with the mother. So again, this vertical relationship tends to downplay what you might call horizontal relationships, in the sense of, same generation kin. And so in the family, it makes for different dynamics. If you notice in this, what's missing is the father. The father becomes an abstracted figure. Now, I'm not sure that was necessarily the case back in the, say, rural farming period of, say, 300 to 700 years ago. I suspect it was, but we don't really have a lot of, other than Japanese literature and especially poetry, there isn't really a lot about that. So Japanese were, to the best of my knowledge, really their literature prose system traditionally really didn't have a lot to do, discussion about this. But where you do see this same alliance system in terms of subordinates, supporting their superiors, seniors, and their seniors sponsoring their subordinates, would be with the political structure of Japanese society in terms of the daimyo or regional lords and samurai. fact, the 47 Ronin is a perfect case in point. The 47 Ronin are the subordinates to Naganori, the Naganori, the Asano clan. And that's the parent, that's the senior. And Asano Naganori, by virtue of being a senior, is responsible for the juniors and subordinates underneath him. So that that whole motivation and logic of why you do what you do and who you're aligned to is seen classically in the 47 Ronin. Because if you think about it, if that was based on a system of sort of classic hierarchy of power, then everyone should have said, well, this is really bad. Kiri Yoshinaka is a bad boy, but the shogun should be sacrosanct because he's the big dog. He's the head of the system. But going after the shogun's entirely legit because your relationships, if you're one of the 47 Ronin, is to your senior. And that's Oshio, Yoshi Oshio, the actual head of the 47 was the senior to the other 46. But it also means to all of those guys, they were junior to the Asano clan, which is their senior. But more specifically, they were junior to Asano Naganori, who was, in their view, their superior, and they're his subordinates. So what this means is Japanese society, on one hand, spends a great amount of time talking about social rank, but the reality is in Japanese society is social rank is defined by these Oyaba and Koban type relationships. It's not defined by the title that you carry. And as I mentioned, I think earlier, this would be why in Japanese social history, especially in the World War II period, you can have, captains or majors killing the generals that are underneath, that are over them. Why? Because you don't have the Oyaba and Koban relationship with that guy. He might be your superior, but he's not your emotional senior. So therefore, if your emotional senior, grumbles, well, the general so-and-so isn't doing what he should do, then you can very easily see how one of these guys is going to think, well, that's, we got to fix that. Bang. So this is why Japanese companies tend to be at some points really dysfunctional when there's any changes in senior management, because what that means is competitive groups are going to be trying to push their group of allegiance ahead at the cost of the other groups. And what's going to happen in many cases, Sony was famous for this in the 80s and 90s, is that other groups, that the entire corporation might take it on the chin because of the infighting within these various factions within the company. But given the logic of Japanese society, it's easy to see, well, if you're part of a faction, at some point in a real weird way, you don't give a rat's ass what happens to the larger company as long as your faction succeeds. So it's pervasive to all Japanese social relationships. Japanese that don't know each other, that find themselves in a situation where they've got to work effectively with each other, especially for an extended period of time, will almost invariably fall into some sort of senior-junior relationship. And that's because to Japanese, that's how any social relationship that has any emotional investment in it has to have a senior-junior component to it. You can't have two folks that are equals working together. That doesn't exist. Then they can't even visualize it. So the Oyaba and Koban relationship in all its various dynamic forms is how Japanese structure social relationships. If you see a relationship where you don't have that, at least in my view in Japanese society, is I would argue that no one has any emotional investment in it. It's people making noise. And what's really scary is I know one situation we got involved in peripherally, where you could see that you had that type of dynamic. People were making noise about how they were equals. But in reality, what you were looking at was, three people in a room, but each of them was actually affiliated to a faction within their various company. So they were sort of the representative of that faction in the room. So they weren't going to waste any time and effort with the other two folks, even within the same company in the room, because they weren't part of the same faction. And it took a couple of months before we figured that out. And at that point, trying to get things to work was sort of a waste of time because you weren't going to get any agreement between the three of them because they all had their own set of vested interests, and they weren't the vested interests of the company. They were the vested interests of their particular faction. And at least for those three people, their faction had to win, and that meant that the other two had to lose. So there's no way you were going to get any collective agreement, in that situation. So we just, we told the company, break that up and come up with some other way to do it because this isn't going to go anywhere. It was interesting when we actually mentioned to senior managers. It's hard to phrase it in such a way that didn't cause trouble, but they're sort of like, oh yeah, oh well, we thought it might work. Now they were totally not surprised. Um, okay, gender roles. Um, Gender roles in Japanese society they're not really that different than Chinese society, except like I mentioned earlier, they tend to be much more structured and there tends to be a lot less flexibility in terms of what you actually see in a dynamic situation versus what you might call stereotypic norm. Japanese are going to be much closer to a stereotypic norm. I would think that any group of Japanese you into, if you figure out what's going on, you can pretty much make a pretty good generalization in terms of social dynamics, and you're going to be right a large proportion of the time. You try that with Chinese and you're going to end up in trouble because basically, on one hand, there's the rules, but then as far as the Chinese are concerned, any situation might or might not follow the rules or might not follow part of the rules. And if you just sort of assume rules are going to work, you end up looking really stupid really fast. Japanese society, you're probably not going to go too far wrong a huge amount of the time. So male roles, so men's roles in Japanese society. The first and most important is you're the son. You're a member of the EA. This is the folks under the same roof. So it's not necessarily just genealogical. Um, as with our other Asian counterparts, there's this tremendously strong attitude that you have to contribute to the family success or survival. And so individualism is subordinated to the success of the EA, to the success of the people under the same roof. Three, you have to generate new males so that the family can persist on to the next generation. And of course, as with other Asian societies, this is because that's the group that supports folks when they get old. Four, and this is uniquely more Japanese, is you have to support your mom. Your mother, the mother role, your oyabun is absolutely central to the Japanese, social dynamic. And this is why if you ever watch a Japanese awards ceremony, whether it be, in the arts or whatever, even in sports, what you'll find very frequently is they go to give an award to somebody. And what'll happen is they'll immediately call up the mother and they'll give her this huge bouquet of flowers that she's sort of buried behind. And immediately whoever got the award is supposed to, go up and actually thank their mom for all the guidance and support. And she's who made this possible. Now, in other societies, you might have that. I suppose in American society, you might have someone do a little speech like that. And people are going to think it's sort of sweet and that's nice, and maybe sort of believe it. But in Japanese society, that's expected. If you took credit for something and didn't credit your mom, oh, that would be ugly, especially now with social media. So supporting mom is a important part of being a son. And last is in the workplace. You have to be loyal to your senior or your protector, or, whatever guardian that you want to call them in the workplace. And of course, part of that then is also in the workplace, you have to become a senior to the new subordinates that come in to provide a role model to them and also show how good your senior was in terms of bringing you up and the fact that you can then take that role on. So remember, this is a continuing cycle. It's like an assembly line, if you want. It doesn't just end with two individuals. It's a constantly growing or constantly changing but nurturing set of relationships. Women in Japanese society, first off, is support the family. Now, this means the family of birth. In other words, the folks in the EA. Now, it's not unusual in Japanese society. I don't think it ever has been. It's actually fairly common, especially now, like I think I mentioned before, with the rapidly collapsing birth rate. It's very typical for women in Japanese society to have to give up both their career and also the potential for marriage to take care of their parents or senior family members. It's very typical for if there's more than one girl in the family, one will sort of take that role on, which traditionally would have been part of the role of the son. But then women, since women are the nurturers, they sort of become, if you would, the mothers for their parents. If and when she gets married, she then does the same thing for the husband's family. So she's expected to be the nurturer obviously for the kids, but also the nurturer for his parents when they get old. That's not his job, that's her job. Um, maybe more so. I'm not really sure if it's more so than Chinese society, but it's certainly, well, it just is what it is. She's expected to manage the house financially, decision making, any sort of decision making. That's actually her kuleana. That's her job. And that also includes managing her husband, because you have to remember, as in the rest of Asian societies, men are kids. Men are basically adult children. They never grow up emotionally. They never grow up, I would argue, behaviorally. And this is a huge thing for guys. Guys sort of expect to be able to continue being kids till they keel over. So they can have weird hobbies. They can do all sorts of weird stuff and get away with it. They don't. The idea that you have to grow up and be responsible in Japanese society would mean that as a male, is that you have to become part of a workplace, work an web and Koban, social network, and you have to go to work because that's your responsibility as to your senior. But that's sort of where growing up ends. They're not expected to have to grow up in terms of the way that they treat their wives, or in some cases, almost anyone else. You see this dramatically when you watch drinking behavior. Chinese, they drink, and I should point out, in Asia, this is not just in Asia, but it's certainly true in all of Asia. Drinking is an expected aspect of social networking, because when you drink, you're not in control of your mouth, and you're not in control of your behavior. So in Chinese society, people will go out drinking with you because they want to find out who you actually are. And Chinese are very good at not showing their true face or their true feelings until they get ripped. When they get ripped, then it's like, all bets are off. The bandages get torn off. And that's important for Chinese, because you can't have a trusting relationship with folks you're not born to unless you understand where they're actually coming from. So that's the purpose of drinking. Japanese society operates in a very different way. Japanese society, drinking is a way that you absolve yourself of any social responsibility. So the minute the Japanese start drinking, then they can say whatever they want to say, they can do whatever they want to do, and there's no consequence to those actions. Actually, I should point out that's actually also true in Chinese society. When you get drunk in Asia, you're not going to be held accountable when you become sober later. What happens when you're drunk stays with being drunk. Now, what that means, among other things, is people won't repeat what you say when you're drunk anywhere in Asia. I cannot imagine what would happen if someone tried to actually, video a group of drunken Chinese or Japanese in a situation and then post that on social media. That person would be completely ostracized, I think, from the entire society. Yeah, you can't. It's drinking is always considered sort of a private social thing. Having said that, guys in Japan, when they drink, can get pretty calculated about how drunk they are, for one, and secondly, they become incredibly emotional, and it's usually tied to this senior junior thing. So it's not unusual when Japanese drink, for example, for juniors, they're drinking with their senior, to literally go and start crying on their shoulder, and just doing all sorts of stuff that you're sort of, whoa. And that's sort of expected. Seniors, in a sort of resigned way, expect juniors to behave like little children. And that's what drink allows you to do. Now, notice how that also then reinforces the relationship, that you can trust the senior because you can do those things and the senior expects it. And the senior, in some ways, actually encourages it. But also, the senior expects that you trust them enough and you honor them enough to act like a child in front of them and know that there's not going to be a consequence to it. So drinking is a very complicated thing. I suppose maybe in part people do it as an emotional escape, certainly, but they also do it as a way to get around things that they can't discuss with in public, or when you're sober. But yeah, the key part of this is also that just men are children. Men aren't responsible. I think it's not by accident that, at least in what my limited experience with Japanese, is guys tend to be really into, for example, oftentimes pretty exotic hobbies, and oftentimes pretty expensive. And will think nothing of going to Ashihara, for example, and buying, you know, maybe $5,000 worth of trains, because they like to rate train sets. And they might not even actually have that money, But what they'll do is they'll spend it because I want it. Um, in Asian societies, in this case specifically Japanese society, only women are seen as truly adult. Now, women take on the adult behavioral role. Not too long after that image of the kids we saw. So here, oops. So what you find with these kids is as these kids grow, in fact, even by this age, I'm willing to bet some of that's already in play, that some of these kids, especially the boy here, are going to be able to act more like kids than the female counterparts. Just given the baby here, I'd say this girl here is already taking on an adult role. So if these kids are all goofing around, she's probably the one that says, well, maybe we shouldn't do this, or, we got to get back to the bus, or whatever it might be. She's already taking on a role that's older than her years, you might say, emotionally. This one, I don't know, it's hard to tell. I mean, people are people, obviously, and personalities are different. But I would say that she's at least to me, she's looking like someone that's going to be an adult. And even though she's a girl and she's not that old, I bet she's already taking on adult roles. And that's probably also true already in the house. So at a very young age, girls are expected to grow up, if you would, real quickly. Boys like him are not expected to ever really grow up. They're expected to take on a set of responsibilities because they're part of an EA, et cetera, et cetera. But actually, sort of emotionally growing up is not something that guys really have to worry about to a huge extent in Japanese society. That's one of the huge benefits of being a guy. Is on one hand, he's going to be, if he's a typical Japanese, he's going to work in the workplace from the time he's, 21 years old till he's in his late 60s. And he's going to be in some sort of Oiben Koben relationship with other folks. But he'll still behaviorally, in many ways, probably act like he was still, 8 or 10 or however these kids are. She, by this age, is already being an adult. By the time she's 15, 16, 17 years old, there won't be much of a kid left. She'll be an adult female. She might not be physiologically, but in terms of behavior, she's entirely different than him. They're two entirely separate ways, two entirely separate groups. Now to sort of make some exotic, versions of this, when you're looking at Japanese society, everyone in a structured social situation is going to be senior and junior. So, there's these, we'll say hypothetically, these two guys here work for the same company, which I don't think is, no, they got different kind on the back. We'll say hypothetically they work for the same company. If they're hanging out together, one of them will automatically, by definition, be senior. Now, it might be him. He looks like he might be a little bit older, but it might not. Senior and junior is a behavioral thing. These two guys here, this is near the Asakusa Shrine. And there's, this whole sort of side business of running what they call rickshaws. I can't remember what the Japanese term is, the little carts that they haul people around in. So these guys work for a company, or maybe it's their own company. Of these two guys, one is junior and one's senior. I have no idea which is which, but frequently, if you just watch people for just a couple of minutes, you can very quickly figure out who's the senior and who's the junior. Japanese are real clear about this, and it makes Japanese society sort of, and it's fun to watch Japanese because once you figured out the rules, you realize there's almost no variation in the rules. Again, like I mentioned before. So even though they're dressed the same, even though they're the same, they might be the same rank in terms of how much they get paid or whatever in the company. What you'll find is they're not the same. There's always going to be someone who's superior and someone who's inferior or subordinate. Classic image of Shinsaibashi. I see this actually with two groups here, since this isn't why the picture was taken, but nonetheless it's handy. You got these two guys walking here. Now, again, I can guarantee in that situation, one of them is senior and one's junior. Yeah, I can't really guess. It's sort of hard to tell. But again, if you watch them for a very short period of time, you'll figure that out. These two guys here, senior and junior, my guess is he's senior, he's junior, just by the way they dress. And you could, it's fun to do. I mean, sometimes you're wrong and you watch it, oh, I had it backwards. But what you do know is these guys aren't the same. They're not equals. These two guys aren't equal. It's not that one's on a bicycle, one's walking, and one's in a classic salaryman suit, and the other's not. Um, Actually, that would sort of suggest he might be senior. Anyways, so what you're going to get is you're never going to find even two Japanese together who are the same rank. Now, in Chinese societies, these might be brothers, they might be cousins or something like that. At that point, they really are sort of the social rank. They don't hierarch themselves the same way. So this is part of that sort of unique Japanese of social dynamics. Any group of Japanese in any relationship are going to be hierarched in some way. And they're going to all be aware of that. And if you understand Japanese well enough, and to be honest, I don't, you can actually just if you're walking behind them and you hear their conversation, you will, by virtue of that conversation, immediately understand what the dynamic of that relationship is, because they phrase their Japanese slightly differently based on if it's seniors talking to juniors use slightly different prefixes in certain words, especially verbs. Juniors talking to seniors use slightly different prefixes in terms of talking to each other. And that's expected. And this is one of the reasons why if you're not totally 200% fluent in social Japanese, Japanese call people who are fluent in Japanese but don't use the social hierarchy thing as horizontal Japanese. And they're very uncomfortable talking to people like that because on one hand, their Japanese is fluent. So it's not that they don't understand them. But without the social context, it's sort of like, well, who the hell are you? And what am I to you? Because you're not telling me if I'm superior to you or inferior to you. So what are you? And so they sort of see them as alien. And this is why if you're a foreigner or even, Japanese but born outside of Japan, if you go to Japan and you're not fluent in that social dynamic of vertical Japanese linguistically, you're going to actually make your Japanese a little worse. A friend of mine from San Francisco who was born in a totally Japanese family, they're Japanese, they spoke it since they were a child. But unfortunately, because they learned it in the United States, they never picked up some of the social cues to the point where it's automatic. So the minute they open their mouth, people realize that they don't really understand the nuances of vertical Japanese. So what they do is they intentionally make their Japanese a little bit goofy. They mispronounce some stuff, they pause a little bit, and now everyone's happy. They constantly get complimented on how good their Japanese is. But at the same time, it's sort of patronizing because it's basically saying your Japanese is really, really good. I have no trouble understanding you, but it's really making me more comfortable because you're not trying to play a game that you can't play, which is this hierarchical Japanese. So I'm going to say hypothetically, these three folks here would be one of these, groups that will say Japanese, maybe university students or something. And in that context, there's going to be senior and juniors. And so, any group you see here hanging around is senior and juniors. Sometimes you can see that by dress. Oftentimes you can't. But the minute they interact with each other, you're going to see the difference in terms of behavior. Now, of course, classically, what you'd see is if there's some situation where they're greeting each other formally, that would be the classic image of the Japanese bow, because juniors always have to bow deeper to seniors. That's giving them respect. It's respecting their authority and seniority. And this is why, calculating a bow in Japan is incredibly complicated, and no one I know, except for Japanese, can ever quite figure it out right. If you bow too deeply, it actually looks like you're bullshitting. If you don't bow deep enough, it implies a level of sort of competitive equalness that really makes people uncomfortable. So it's, Chinese, on the other hand, don't bow. Chinese might nod their head, but Chinese usually clasp the hands is the traditional form. Modern Chinese sort of do a little bit of a head nod. But to be honest, in China, if you do a classical, grasping of the hands in front of you, people like that because Chinese really think that's sort of cool because you only do that if you understand Chinese traditional social history. So it sort of implies, on one hand, I'm not Chinese, but on the other hand, I know something about Chinese history. So they actually see it as a compliment. Japanese don't do that with the bow, and Japanese don't have a hand equivalent. The bow is very formal. So on one hand, you've got a shopping street, but what that also means is the person here in the shop, they're going to be junior to whoever owns the shop, because I can guarantee in a small shop like this, it's there's a senior and then there's all the juniors. Now, having said this is part of a chain, and we'll just hypothetically assume this is a chain of shops. what you're going to find is maybe in different shops. Yeah, usually in different shops, but also, maybe some other dynamic. There's going to be competitive factions within the company. And part this might be seen as, in many companies, they work this in a very calculated way. So they'll set up one Oibun in one shop, and another Oibun will set up another shop, maybe just down the street here in Nagoya. And the idea is the two shops are going to compete with each other. And the juniors, like we'll say hypothetically, this guy, he's supposed to work really, really hard to make his senior look good. Now, if that means he screws over the sister shop down here so the corporate profits drop, but his senior looks better, than as far as he's concerned, he's won. So you're not talking about the success of the company, you're talking about the success of your faction. If it sounds like I'm overemphasizing it, I'm not, because it's important to understand the Japanese see all social relationships within this dynamic. So it sort of is what it is. Japanese, Asian view, like I've mentioned a bunch of times, Asian views of marriages are that they're contractual relationships between two families or two groups. Chinese marriages are contractual relationships between two clans in one shape or form. Japanese marriages are relationships between two ie. So it's different. The logic is the same. Marriages are not between individuals. Marriages are between groups. And what this means is engagement. Yeah, in English should be engagement. Engagement is oftentimes a very long, drawn out process, especially if it is complicated. For example, in my case, Asians to non-Asians, Chinese to non-Chinese. That becomes very complicated just because, Chinese being real sophisticated, especially if they're from Hong Kong, they know that Euro-Americans don't have clans. And so that makes any relationship with a non-Chinese real complicated because you don't know who's involved in the family. What does an American family consist of? Classic American image of in-laws. Well, who the hell is that? So because when families marry, that means that the families are married. And yeah, you might have two individuals on the cusp of that, but the families now are in a permanent relation. Remember, the key here is permanent. So you've got to figure out who all the players in the game are going to be before you make this into a serious engagement and actually pursue this. Traditionally, Japanese societies were called miai. These are arranged marriages. And this would generally be within the neighborhood, or maybe two, neighborhoods that are next to each other. And this is because that means that you can, traditionally you go through a Koseki register. More recently, what you do is you just ask around the neighborhood. So everyone, you want to know everyone in the family that's going to be in the EA that you marry into, so that there's no surprises. Again, remember the key here is sociobiology. You need to know what people's inherited potential and behavior is. And you're going to find that only manifest in the group because any individual something will be part of that. So you need to know what that is before you actually commit to a permanent relationship. So as with Chinese and Korean societies, marriages are contractual relationships between families. They're not, love matches like American movies and was it Bachelor and the Bachelorette and stuff like that, which of course will work out really well. I'm willing to bet that in Asia that they watch shows like that, they're probably thinking like, good Lord, what are those people thinking? Anyways, the Japanese term for this, for love matches or renai marriages, I have some friends, husband and wife, and they're actually the result of a renai marriage. They've been married now for 30 years, and they actually bring it up pretty frequently. In fact, even the family, when the family's getting together, everyone will talk about, wow, this one actually worked out. And this is sort of this people. People are amazed at the durability of that love match marriage, because in their view, love matches are infatuations. They're temporary, superficial affairs that aren't going to last, more than maybe a year or two, if that long. Versus arranged marriages, which are permanent. Also, the other problem with renai or love matches is they frequently would not involve the family to the same consequence till all of a sudden the couple's married. And then the families are going to get really pissed off because they they didn't vet the whole process, you might say, but now they're stuck with in-laws that they have not been, in many cases, been able to really check out yet. One of the side effects of this is if you're in a Japanese company, you can be asked, and it's not unusual for someone who's a senior or seen as a senior, but usually you're senior. One of the jobs of seniors for the subordinates is to find them spouses. This is a little less happening now in the 2020s, simply because of the gender collapse in Japanese society. It's hard for seniors to take this role on because they generally can't find women to be the prospective brides to their juniors, who are almost invariably going to be male. But traditionally the nakodo at the workplace was one of the parts of the job description that seniors had. You were expected to provide spouses for your juniors. If for no other reason, that gives them the emotional stability to then commit more to the company. In Japanese society, this is very formalized even today. There's a formal proposal. It's after the families have checked each other out. So we'll say that's been vetted, and no one's acting really weird about the whole thing. What they'll do is there'll be a proposal. So, the guy and usually his father, but maybe uncle, but in the workplace it would be his senior, would then approach the family of the prospective bride and say, my subordinate or my son, or generally it'd be my subordinate, is interested in your daughter. Would that be okay if they pursue this potential relationship? And then, as long as they don't pull out a gun and start chasing you down the street, then it's like, okay. At that point, then you pursue the formal investigation. Now, this would, till recently, in fact, in most cases, would probably still involve some sort of private detective agency. I think some companies, I heard a rumor once that two Japanese companies we work with, actually have a private detective agency on contract to provide this service for the male employees of the company and their seniors. That would make that's a perfectly logical and rational thing to do. Though I suspect American companies and their HR departments would be absolutely freaked out. What you then got to find is then MII meetings. If you ever want to see a bunch of these, go to the hotels. If you go to Narita Airport, stay at the hotels outside the airport. The bigger, fancier hotels will have almost invariably, especially if it's from like spring through late autumn, and you show up on like a Thursday or a Friday or a Saturday, you'll see groups of people looking really uncomfortable coming into the hotel, and they're going to meet with another group of equally uncomfortable looking people. Huge fun to watch if you're having lunch or something like that. What you're seeing is the formal MII meeting between the two families. So this is when the families actually get together and see whether they can actually coexist. They're testing the waters to see if they can coexist in a relationship. In Japanese society today, it's really not uncommon at all for the two families to have. I think we actually saw one of these once. We were at one of these hotels. The meeting had gone about, they'd gone through lunch, and then my wife and I both noticed that they seemed to break up pretty quickly. And usually there's a long extent sort of goodbye, a lot of formal bowing, and sort of like, okay, see you next time, that type of stuff. This one sort of seemed like, oh man, it's too bad, we got to go. And one group basically almost like bolted. What that means is that's a very good chance that was a collapsed MII meeting. Now, what'll happen is folks will get blamed if because the family or the seniors are putting all the effort into this stuff, and these are expensive. So if you get the couple together, and we'll say that the prospective groom, suddenly looks at his in-laws and going, "Holy shit, this isn't going to work," then he'll sort of make a bunch of noise, and maybe he or maybe his dad or someone else in his part of the group, his family, his EA, will sort of make stuff, and they'll start making mistakes, or somehow they'll put out behavioral cues, that this ain't happening. Something's wrong with this. It has a bad vibe, they'd say back in 1970s culture. And it breaks up. And I'm pretty sure we saw that. That's one of those situations where you really sort of wish you'd had video, vid cam that you could actually record that. That would be totally illegal and not totally in bad form, but nonetheless. So I'm pretty sure that MIAI meeting would balk. And what you'll find is some folks, more and more, what you find, this is actually pretty common. It's not unusual for people to go through 2 or 3 MIAIs before the two families at that particular meeting decide to go ahead. So one MIAI falls apart. That means those two folks are not going to get married, and those two families, disappear and never meet again. The guy meets someone else, or the senior sets him up with someone else. They try it again. Boom, same thing happens. The senior sets him up with a third one. It's sort of like, and there's sort of a hint going on here, especially when they go to drinking and, like Thursday or Fridays. The senior will probably tell him, you've effed up 2 of these MIAI meetings. At some point you've got to step up to the plate and be an adult and get married. So the senior's pointing in not very, subtle ways that I'm not going to keep on doing MIAI meetings for you for the next, 20 years of your life. I know of one lady, I'm not sure if it's actually true, but we were told by someone that she actually had gone through 6 MIAI meetings and rejected all of the all the spouses' families. And what happened is after the 6th one, the family just said, fine, you're not getting married. We're not going to waste any more time with this. It's making the family look stupid. We have these meetings, the family get together. There's an expectation of something happening, and then you torpedo it. It's like, why are you wasting everyone's time? So just forget it. You're going to be single for the rest of your life. So there's a clock ticking on this. Now, I should point out, just as a note, there's another clock ticking. This is the fact. Guys are expected to be married by the time they're 28 or 29, especially if they're salarymen, if they're the employed Japanese. And that's because, you can't behaviorally, you have to have a wife to support you, socially, financially, managerially, once you've, sort of developed a real career, which would be your late 20s. Women are expected to be married by the time they're 23 to 25. The classic slang, and actually the Chinese and Japanese have the same term, is the old wedding cake, which sort of implies, I guess maybe when you have weddings, maybe people will take parts of the cake away, the wedding cake, it's like snack after, I don't know. Anyways, so it sort of implies you've been a bridesmaid, but you've never been a bride. You're supposed to be married by the time certainly by 26. Any later than that, if you're a woman in Japan, or even in China for that matter, and you're say 27, 28, 30, whatever, and you've never been married, the chances of getting married are really, really, really slim. Now, this is changing a little bit just because in both Japan and China, the number of women demographically compared to men is so small. So it's cut women a little bit of slack. But guys almost invariably, especially if they're drinking, you bring it up. They'll go, yeah, well, this is what I had to settle with. I had to settle for this because I didn't get married to someone that was the right age group. Traditionally in Japanese society, it's certainly even true in Chinese society, the woman should be younger than the guy, usually by a couple of years, but not a lot. 5 years or more than that, and that's people are sort of going, so there's a whole set of sort of informal stuff on top of this very formal meeting. So the MIAI meeting is done. And let's stop here for a second. I got to find something. Okay, had to fish up a photo. So what happens is we'll say that the MIAI's gone well. So everyone's happy. The prospective spouses are okay with their partner and the other family, et cetera, et cetera. At that point, now it kicks into gear. What you now have is a formal set of gift giving. Now, Chinese do this even more, but in both Chinese and Japanese society, the gifts are very ritualized. So they're not normal stuff. They'd be like particular types of dried fish. Particular things are given because that's symbolically, it's the husband's family showing the wife's family that they can provide for both the wife, but also they're going to be, they're good folks. They're trustworthy folks. The wife's family's gifts are going to show that they're willing to give up their daughter, but they're giving her up to a family that they trust. So these are highly ritualized gift giving. It's not, you can go to a Japanese department, shortly like Takashimaya or something like that. I'm pretty sure you could actually go to their gift giving and actually ask them for the, wedding package. And I'm willing to bet they actually have it already packaged up and wrapped up and beautifully decorated. I remember actually we did come to think of one of the, again, In one of the hotels, we did see this. They actually did this in a hotel, which I thought was sort of odd. But you can have this pretty much anywhere. But some sort of central place. Narita Airport's, as central as it gets in Japan. So I strongly recommend staying at the hotel airports, not because they're necessarily nice places to stay, but if you like watching people and you understand the dynamics of what's going on, you can see whole parts of Japanese, sort of social dynamics that we're talking about in this class, actually on display there for you. And it's absolutely fascinating to see how accurate and how normative a lot of this stuff is. There's very little variation on theme. Now, when this is all done, then you're eventually, and everyone, everything's gone well. And again, since everyone knows what it is, there's no variation on a theme. Everyone knows what's supposed to be done. What it also means at a very comfortable level is everyone's expectations have been met. So there's no one doing anything weird, and that's the key. Can't have any weird stuff going on. Again, remember, this is sociobiology. Weird stuff means that weird shit's going to happen down the road. So there's none of that. So what then happens is you're going to get married. Now, Japanese, well, this is true in all of Asia, but especially in Japanese society, you don't marry at ritual locations. Well, you do if you're the upper class. That image I gave you of the Osaka, the temple, Taisha, that's the upper class, and they're a totally different. The royal family, the imperial family, is an entirely different social dynamic, etc. They're like the exception to the rule. Everyone else in Japan will get married someplace like this. This is a marriage hall. Where was this? Oh, Kanazawa, I think. We happen to be walking by it. This is the classic Japanese marriage hall. Every Japanese town has these, even if some of them not particularly large size. Though a small town like Takayama, I don't remember seeing one in Takayama, but I'm willing to bet what happens is everyone goes up to Kanazawa or maybe down to Nagoya probably and does it there. So the families go, take the train down to the big city, which would be Nagoya. So what happens is that this place actually does all the wedding stuff. So this is a very sophisticated business. They have separate hall rooms where people meet. They actually have rooms where if you're doing the formal gift giving or the formal engagement, they actually have rooms where they can do that. I'm willing to bet they can provide you with the actual stuff that you're supposed to give in the engagement if you want to pay for that. All this is expensive. I should point out Japanese weddings are stunningly expensive. Chinese weddings more so. But then Chinese weddings have more variety in them. Japanese weddings are pretty much the same thing. It says something that you can have what is in many ways almost like a factory operation, and they can stay in business and be successful just because all the weddings look exactly the same. This place on a busy day, we should have gone in and asked them, but I'd be willing to bet that they probably do from 3 to 10 weddings a day at this location. Notice they've got a Western, sort of a structured, what looks like Western chapel here. One of my colleagues actually teaches for us, but also actually spent time in Japan, both as English teaching faculty, but then also as teaching Japanese teaching classes at Japanese universities. Is actually certified as a Western style, I don't know what you call it, not preacher. Anyways, he does the weddings, the Western part of a wedding ceremony. So what happens is this is all very structured. The couples come in, all the outfits are provided. You can even see this in Hawaii. This is the places like the two in Kakako that provide all the outfits for guys and women in terms of the marriages, because in many cases, once they've done the ceremony here, they will do a second marriage ceremony somewhere else. Now, through the early 2015 period, for Japanese, that was a second wedding in Hawaii, usually on Oahu. That's been cut back a lot, both the cost, but also, I think people just sort of decided it really wasn't worth the hassle. So they might do a honeymoon, but even then they might have a few people over. But wedding chapels were a big deal in Hawaii. A bunch of those companies have gone under, but they were basically almost like branches of these operations back in Japan. So the two families meet here. There's folks that coordinate, wedding coordinators that run the entire thing. I actually saw a copy of one of the wedding things, and it was actually down to the minute. So for 3 minutes, you're going to meet here. For 5 minutes, you're going to change into these outfits here. For 15 minutes, you're going to be in this place here where they do the Shinto ceremony. Then at 2:05 in the afternoon, you're going to move over to this place. From 2:15 to 2:35, you'll do the Western part of the ceremony here in the sort of surrogate chapel. And they guarantee that the guy doing the ceremony will be some, holier Western guy doing it, not some Japanese guy, because it doesn't look right. It's got to look foreign. Then you're going to go and you're going to go back into here, and from say 3 to 4:15, you're going to have I suppose in the United States you'd call a reception here in one of the larger rooms here. Everyone's poured out of the doors, at 4:15, whether sober or not, and then they're shipped to their relative vehicles or bus or whatever, and then they go home. So this whole thing is choreographed literally down to the minute, and you'll see people on their iPhones or iWatches and stuff like that, running these things. And it makes most militaries look sloppy, and that's how these places are run. So if you're going to a Japanese wedding ceremony, don't plan on farting around. You're going to be told exactly what's going on all the time. You're just supposed to be almost like a passive, witness. I'm not even sure if you call it participant, to be honest, in some ways. And that's the Japanese wedding. And the key thing about this is any Japanese wedding looks exactly the same as any other Japanese wedding. There's not going to be variation isn't something. People aren't looking for uniqueness. People aren't looking for different. People are looking for a comfort zone of predictability. And again, you have to remember in Japanese society, they've got enough unpredictability between the climate, earthquakes, and all the rest of Japanese life. The Japanese world is an unpredictable world. So the last thing they want to do is bring unpredictability into something like marriage, which is seen as a permanent scenario. The wedding hall is a fascinating example of Japaneseness. I would suspect if you go on YouTube and type in Japanese wedding hall, people have got to actually have videos up of, the ceremonies. I used to have a couple, but I can't think of where they are now. That actually walk you through how the ceremony takes place and all the parts of it. And the choreography is mind-boggling. It really is the equivalent of putting together a car or a phone or something like that. It's amazing how sophisticated it is and how everyone that's involved is passive. You just get this herd of people just following someone who's basically okay, you got to go here, and you got a minute to get down to the end of the hallway and sit down in this room. And everyone's sort of down the room. Okay, you've been here for 5 minutes. Get up. I got to go in the other direction. And eventually, everyone sort of spit out the front of here, and it's like it's done. It's sort of like, okay, what just happened? So that's the Japanese wedding. Hugely entertaining. I've only been in one, but that was enough. So the Japanese wedding is a fascinating example of how you have this very structured, very formalized system. There's very little variation placed on part of the country. Even social levels, dynamics don't really change a lot. The very frequently what will happen is the nakodo, or you'll be asked to be in. In fact, the case that I was in, we were there because I was technically the nakodo for the guy who's one of my students. You want to have seniors or folks that are senior to the couple to act as go-betweens, especially during the marriage ceremony, because that sort of vouches for the family. It vouches for the guy especially, that he's a reasonable person. He's got people he's in a social network with, and therefore the wife's family and the wife and such can trust him. So nakodos are a huge part of this, and seniors, you have to be a nakodo. I mean, it comes with the job of being a senior. And if they don't have enough seniors, then they're going to actually, in some cases, ask you if you're sort of if you give them advice occasionally or something like that, you might find that as far as they're concerned, you become nakodo, even if you didn't realize that was the case. And so you can get dragged into this as someone who's a senior, especially, if you're, in my case, if you're a Western academic and you're at a university and you're a professor and stuff like that, then you've got enough social prestige. No one's going to ask any embarrassing questions like, how close are you to the family? Because they're just impressed that, especially if you've got foreigners who are some buddies, at least in their view, that they're willing to get involved in this. That actually gives the family some creds. So, yeah, it can get pretty strange. But this is Japanese weddings. And it's, again, this fascinating manifestation of the Japanese kinship system. And again, I'd strongly suggest go to YouTube and see if you can find, there's got to be tons posted of how Japanese marriages work, especially the marriage ceremony, the wedding hall package, it's usually called. And it's, we don't have time to get into it in this class, but it's enormously fascinating to watch, especially now that you've got enough background to understand the dynamics of what you're seeing in the relationship.